For decades, Vince Gill built a reputation that almost seemed untouchable. One of the most respected voices in country music. A man known as much for his kindness as his talent. But behind that steady image, the past few years have brought a series of events that quietly changed everything. It didn't start with a scandal or a career collapse. It didn't begin with headlines or controversy. It started with something far more personal and far more difficult to control. As his wife Amy Grant faced one life-threatening health crisis after another, Vince Gill found himself in a position he had never been in before. Not on a stage, not in a recording studio, not accepting another award. He found himself in hospital waiting rooms, in quiet recovery routines, in the kind of daily caregiving that no spotlight ever reaches. And the truth is, the weight of those years may be catching up with him in ways that fans are only beginning to understand. The foundation he built. To understand why things feel different now, you have to go back to the beginning, and to how carefully, how deliberately, Vince Gill constructed everything he became. His career didn't arrive overnight. It was assembled piece by piece through consistency, discipline, and a refusal to chase shortcuts. After joining Pure Prairie League in the early 1980s, he quickly proved he wasn't just another replacement singer stepping into a gap. His voice carried a softness that stood out, something intimate, almost conversational, but more importantly, it translated into real results. The song, Let Me Love You Tonight, didn't just become a hit. It established him as someone capable of leading a band through a period of transition and uncertainty. But success at that level didn't make the path ahead any clearer. The band's identity was already shifting around him, and despite his contributions, he was still navigating questions about his own place in the wider industry. That uncertainty followed him into the next phase of his career. Leaving the band to join Rodney Crowell's Circle wasn't a guaranteed upgrade. In fact, it was a risk taken at a moment when his momentum had slowed and his future was genuinely unclear. The Cherry Bombs didn't offer instant fame or a direct lane to stardom, but they gave him something more valuable: proximity to Nashville's inner circle. It was there that he began building relationships that would quietly define the decades ahead, including his connection with producer Tony Brown, who would eventually play a critical role in reshaping how the world heard Vince Gill's voice. Even his early solo work reflects a pattern that would repeat throughout his life. Slow progress, mixed results, quiet persistence. His first releases didn't dominate the charts. He spent stretches of time performing at intimate venues like the Bluebird Cafe, refining his songwriting, and confronting his own limitations with a kind of honesty that didn't come easily. Producers at the time would often push his voice back in the mix, compensating for what they felt was a lack of presence. The irony is that the very quality they were trying to hide, that quiet, unforced intimacy, would eventually become his signature. What changed everything wasn't a sudden breakthrough moment. It was a shift in perspective. When Tony Brown began producing his work, he made a deliberate and counterintuitive decision. He pushed Vince Gill's voice forward. He trusted what he heard. That choice didn't just alter the sound of the records. It redefined how audiences experienced him. And the result was When I Call Your Name, a song that didn't rely on spectacle or production tricks, but on raw, emotional clarity. It earned him major awards and industry recognition, but more importantly, it confirmed something that had always been true. His strength had always been there. It just hadn't been fully heard yet. The first fracture. By the time Vince Gill reached the peak of his success, the part of his life that looked the most stable on the outside was already beginning to fracture behind the scenes. His marriage to Janice Oliver had lasted for years, and from a distance, it looked like a partnership built on shared purpose. They were both part of the same creative world. Both understood the demands of touring and recording, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from a life built around performing. For a long time, that common ground held things together. But what wasn't visible to the public was how the pressures of success were quietly pulling them apart. As his career accelerated through the early years of his breakthrough, Vince was no longer just a working musician trying to find his footing. He had become a central figure in country music, with awards, chart success, and a touring schedule that kept him away from home for long stretches at a time. The same dedication that helped him build his career also created distance in his personal life. Not out of indifference, not because of dramatic failure, but through the slow accumulation of missed time, emotional fatigue, and the kind of disconnect that builds when two people are moving at different speeds in different directions. The divorce didn't arrive with a public explosion or a tabloid spectacle, but its impact was significant. When it was finalized, custody of their daughter Jenny went to Janice, and Vince had to adjust to a reality that many people in his position rarely discuss openly. He was no longer part of a daily family structure. He was no longer there for the ordinary moments, the mornings, the dinners, the small rituals that define a life shared with someone. That absence carried a weight that couldn't be measured in headlines or album sales. What followed in his music reflected it. The songs became more introspective, more emotionally honest, and in some cases more direct than anything he had released before. Critics began pointing out that his songwriting carried a different kind of authenticity, one that suggested lived experience rather than crafted storytelling. The emotional tone had changed. There was a sense of loss in the work, but also a sense of acceptance. A sense of a man trying to process something that couldn't be resolved quickly or neatly. A new beginning and a new kind of pressure. Vince Gill's relationship with Amy Grant didn't begin under simple circumstances. At the time, both of them were coming out of their own marriages, and their connection drew attention for reasons that went beyond music. For some fans and observers, it was difficult to separate the timing of their relationship from the end of his previous one. That tension followed them in the early stages, adding a layer of public scrutiny to what was already a deeply personal transition. But what made this relationship different wasn't how it started. It was how it evolved. Amy Grant wasn't just another partner entering his life during a period of change. She represented something more significant, a shift in how he understood both his career and his identity. The two shared a quieter, more grounded perspective on life, one that contrasted sharply with the relentless pace and pressure of the music industry they had each been navigating for years. Their marriage brought a sense of stability that hadn't always been present. It required Vince to confront parts of himself that had been easy to ignore when his focus was entirely on work. For years after their marriage, Vince Gill and Amy Grant appeared to have found something rare in the entertainment world. A relationship that didn't just survive change, but seemed to grow stronger because of it. They built a life that was far less chaotic than what either of them had known before, grounded in family, faith, music, and a shared understanding of what actually mattered when the applause faded. But everything shifted in a way neither of them saw coming. The first crisis, a routine visit that wasn't. In 2020, it was Vince Gill who went in for a routine medical checkup after noticing shortness of breath while climbing stairs. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't an emergency. It was the kind of thing most people would brush off for weeks before finally doing something about it. When the results came back, his doctor told him his heart was in excellent condition, and even joked that his only real problem was being out of shape. It could have ended there. Another ordinary checkup. Another clean bill of health. But instead, the doctor turned to Amy Grant and suggested she undergo testing as well. Her family had a history of heart problems, and given that she was there, it made sense to check. She resisted at first. She felt completely fine. There were no symptoms, no warning signs, no reason to worry. But eventually she agreed. What followed changed everything. The tests revealed that Amy Grant had a rare congenital heart defect, a condition that disrupts the way blood flows through the heart. It wasn't something that had developed recently. It had always been there waiting. And according to the doctor, if it wasn't treated, it would eventually become catastrophic. There was no real option but surgery. Open-heart surgery. The kind of procedure that immediately rearranges your entire sense of what's normal and what matters. The timing made it even harder to bear. This was happening during a period when hospitals were under enormous strain and access was heavily restricted. Vince Gill was not allowed to be present during the operation. For someone who had built his entire life around being present, on stage, in the studio, with his family, that absence was something he couldn't control, couldn't fix, and couldn't will away. He had to leave the hospital and wait, knowing that the most critical moment of his wife's life was unfolding without him there. He later described that loss of control as one of the hardest parts of the entire experience. When he was finally allowed to see her after the surgery, she was still under anesthesia. He described the moment not in dramatic terms, but in a way that quietly revealed how much pressure had been building beneath the surface. Seeing her lying there peaceful, he understood immediately that she had made it through. It wasn't relief in a loud or overwhelming sense. It was quiet, but it was definitive. In that moment, everything else, career, schedules, obligations, legacy, stopped mattering. Because the world had slowed down at the time, Vince Gill was able to step fully into a role that had nothing to do with music. He became her primary support throughout recovery, managing the day-to-day reality of healing that most fans never see and most observers never consider. And what stood out to him wasn't just the physical recovery. It was the way Amy handled it, with a kind of steady resilience, treating each stage not as a crisis to overcome, but as something to move through one careful step at a time. Then came the bike ride. If the heart surgery had been the end of it, Vince Gill might have been able to return to something resembling normal life. The crisis had passed. Recovery was underway. The worst, it seemed, was behind them. But what made the situation far more difficult was what came next. Because just as things were beginning to stabilize, another crisis arrived without warning. And this time, it didn't begin in a hospital. It happened in a single moment, out on the road, during what should have been an ordinary afternoon bike ride. Amy hit a pothole and crashed hard enough to lose consciousness, even while wearing a helmet. The injuries weren't superficial. She suffered a traumatic brain injury that required immediate hospitalization and a recovery process with no clear endpoint, no predictable timeline. For Vince Gill, the shift was immediate. He canceled scheduled performances without hesitation and went straight to her side. But unlike the previous surgery, this wasn't a recovery with a clear finish line. The effects were unpredictable. They couldn't be scheduled around or planned for. There were days when progress seemed real and days when it felt impossibly distant. Amy later admitted that the process was emotionally exhausting in ways that were hard to articulate. Entire parts of her life slowed down. Tours were canceled. Plans disappeared. She was forced into a position where she had to question whether she would ever fully return to the person she had been before. For someone whose identity had been tied to performance and creativity for decades, that kind of uncertainty carries a weight that words struggle to hold. What made this period particularly revealing was how Vince Gill handled it. He didn't try to control the situation or push for faster results. He focused on stability. He reminded her to take each day as it came. At one point, during her lowest moments, he told her something simple but direct, that life continues to bring challenges, and the only real way through is one step at a time. It wasn't a dramatic speech. It wasn't the kind of thing that makes headlines. But it was exactly what she needed to hear. Even as he continued performing when his schedule allowed, the balance of his life had shifted completely. His career was no longer the center of everything. Everything now revolved around whether Amy was getting better. The toll keeps growing. What makes the situation surrounding Vince Gill feel heavier now isn't any single crisis. It's the accumulation, the relentless layering of one challenge on top of another without enough space between them to breathe. After the brain injury, Amy Grant was still dealing with lingering effects that didn't simply disappear with time. Memory lapses became part of daily life, sometimes subtle, sometimes noticeable enough to interrupt ordinary conversations. During one interview, when she was asked to recall details from the early years of their marriage, she openly admitted that those memories felt unclear. It wasn't a dramatic confession, but it revealed something deeper. Some parts of their shared history were no longer fully accessible to her. In those moments, Vince Gill quietly stepped in. He would answer questions for her, clarify timelines, keep conversations moving without drawing attention to what had changed. He described it at one point with characteristic lightness, calling it a tag team. But underneath that humor was a reality that required constant adjustment, constant awareness, constant readiness to step forward without being asked. This wasn't a temporary phase. It was a new normal. At the same time, Amy faced another challenge that struck at the core of her identity as an artist. A cyst in her throat required surgery, and the recovery process meant she had to relearn how to sing. Not refine, not recover stamina. Relearn from the beginning the very thing that had defined her entire life. For someone whose voice had carried her career for decades, that kind of setback is more than physical. It forces a complete reevaluation of identity, confidence, and purpose. And once again, Vince Gill was there, not as a performer or a collaborator, but as the steady presence she relied on to get through it. There was also shoulder surgery, adding another layer to what had already become an exhausting list of medical setbacks. Individually, each of these events could have been managed. Together, they created a prolonged period where uncertainty became the norm, where the question was never really if something else would happen, but when. And for Vince Gill, that meant living in a constant state of vigilance, always prepared for the next setback, always adjusting his own life and schedule around someone else's recovery. The weight of carrying it quietly. What makes this particularly difficult to recognize from the outside is that Vince Gill hasn't changed his public demeanor. He still appears calm. He still performs. He still carries himself the way people have come to expect, with warmth, with humor, with the kind of easy grace that made Nashville call him the nicest guy in town. But the reality behind that image is very different from what it used to be. The past few years have required him to take on a role that doesn't come with applause or recognition or awards. It's the kind of responsibility that slowly reshapes a person, not through a single dramatic moment, but through repetition, patience, and endurance. Through the quiet decision made again and again to show up for someone else before showing up for yourself. And that's where the real concern begins to surface. Not because Vince Gill has failed in any visible way, but precisely because he hasn't. He has carried everything quietly, without letting it spill into public view, without asking for credit or sympathy or acknowledgement. He has simply kept going. But even the strongest people are affected by what they carry over time. Even the most composed individuals reach a point where the accumulated weight of years of crisis, caregiving, and quiet sacrifice begins to leave its mark, not in a single breaking moment, but in the slow erosion of the version of yourself you used to be. When you look at everything Vince Gill has been through, balancing a demanding career while supporting his wife through multiple serious health crises, being excluded from the moments he most wanted to be present for, adjusting